While this series has so far focused on conflict between Ethiopians and foreign enemies, Yohannes' Ethiopia still went through a good amount of internal strife. In spite of the emperor's efforts, Ethiopian political relations had yet to fully recover from the centuries-long Zemen and Muse event, and many of Ethiopia's major lords felt strong rivalries against each other and even the imperial crown. Among these rivalries was that between Negus Menelik of Shawa and Tekle Haimanot of Gojam. The conflict between these two lords not only gives great insight into the inner workings of Ethiopian politics, but would also decide the fates of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people. While Yohannes had been seen as a bit of an outsider by the central provinces of Ethiopia for a long time, the recent victories at Gura and Gondat changed that view. Yohannes was now the protector of the Ethiopian church, and his political influence, credibility, and power skyrocketed among the population. Ethiopia, in general, was left a much more united realm following the common fight against a common enemy. Ethiopia, except for Shawa, that is. While lords from across Ethiopia marched out to fight Gura, Menelik didn't. Not that he supported the Egyptians, he just sat on the sidelines and did his own thing while war waged in the north. To Yohannes, this self-strengthening was a major threat that had to be curbed. Hence, in 1877, he marched an army down to Wälläga to force Menelik's submission. Menelik didn't challenge Yohannes, as the imperial army was still far superior to his own. He unofficially submitted to the emperor, and made this submission official in the 1878 Lecce Agreement. Under the agreement's positions, Menelik became tributary to Yohannes, which meant that in theory, Menelik's power was curbed. In practice it wasn't, and as Menelik planned to further empower himself, he looked southwards. To the south of Ethiopia lie numerous states ruled by various ethnicities, mostly the Oromo. These states contained valuable resources such as ivory, coffee, and gold, and were home to numerous trade routes that could be expanded upon for Shawan economic gain. Menelik himself was keen on expanding trade, and adding these trade routes to connections with the Elsa Sultanate, the French, the Hararis, and the Italians could provide some serious economic benefits. Furthermore, it had long been the aspiration of Shawan kings to bring the southern states into the hands of the Ethiopian Empire, as they were key in re-establishing Ethiopia's old borders. Menelik was no exception to this rule. In 1881, he moved the Shawan capital south from Enkober to Entoto. Menelik was now based nearer to the territories that he planned to invade, and was ready to do so. Except, well, there is a problem. Gojam's economy benefited from the southern trade routes, and the province's governor, Rasadal, wasn't keen on giving up potential influence in the region. Indeed, he was eager to expand his sphere of influence, especially in the land west of the Gai River, and in order for Menelik's plan to succeed, he had to stop that ambition. A rivalry for influence and control over the Gai region evolved. Both Negus Menelik and the Gojami governor launched raids into it. The locals were largely unable to repel them, for while their states had extremely interesting internal politics, they were generally small and squabbled amongst each other. Furthermore, in spite of the Oromo being renowned equestrians in Ethiopia, the armies of the southern states were underarmed and undersized in the face of Ethiopian assault. As a result of this, invading Ethiopian armies often crushed those who attempted to mount resistance, before those same Ethiopian armies forced the resistors to give tribute. By January 20th of 1881, Emperor Yohannes, having decided to back Rasadal to partly curb Menelik's expansion, appointed the Gojami as Negus Tekle Haimanot of Gojam, Agameder, and the Oromo kingdom of Kaffa, supplying him with 8,000 rifles. Kaffa was an Oromo state under Oromo jurisdiction, and not actually under Tekle Haimanot's control, and so Yohannes appointing him as king of the region was a statement to Menelik, telling him to leave off. Menelik didn't do this, of course. After Rastarazo, one of Tekle Haimanot's generals, successfully annexed Goma and extracted tribute from Jima, he encountered Raskobana, one of Menelik's generals. Gobana's force was far better armed and larger than Darazo's, and so the Gojami ceded his collective tribute. Ras Gobana then took tribute from the local leaders and went on to take tribute from Kaffa. Tekle Hamenot was not happy about this development, and complained to the emperor that, quote, "Negus Menelik has deprived me of the territory you gave me." Yohannes tried to avoid war by stalling the issue, and told Tekle Hamenot that land-related issues would be resolved later, before asking the Gojami to return his armies to Gojam. The emperor then sent letters to both Negus Menelik and Negus Tekle Hamenot, insisting that they both avoid combat. The emperor's policy failed. Each king later claimed that they were unable to receive or read Yohannes' letter. Furthermore, the emperor stalled on clearly defining potential borders between Shawan-held territory and Gojami-held territory, likely because he underestimated the speed at which Gobana and Darazo were able to march. This underestimation meant that he probably underestimated exactly how quickly conflict would escalate, meaning that he was in no position to stop a civil war when it was necessary. And that civil war was about to start. The inciting incident of the war is a bit unclear. There are two different accounts that I will be referencing in this video, and while they're not mutually exclusive, one of them does contain a couple of details that the other one doesn't. According to Harold G. Marcus, Tekle Hamenot challenged Menelik to battle after his son was repelled trying to collect tribute from the Gaib states. That said, CAULK has a much more detailed account, which I guess makes sense, because CAULK's paper, Territorial Expansion and the Battle of Embabo, is focused solely on the Battle of Embabo, whereas Harold G. Marcus's book focuses on the history of all of Ethiopia and therefore has to summarize more. So, according to CAULK, in January of 1882, Ras Gobana successfully retrieved tribute from some of the Gaib states, before moving on to receive tribute from the much more hesitant king of Kaffa. Gobana appears to have gotten word that Ras Darazo was preparing an expedition farther south, which was explained in an update from Gobana to Menelik. Gobana also seems to have written that Tekle Hamenot himself was on the way down, which according to CAULK is probably incorrect. Regardless, the letter got Menelik to fully turn his interest westwards, and so he departed in March of 1882. Menelik met up with Gobana, and the two moved further on, Menelik's soldiers plundering the land as they advanced. As a result, Menelik had to order them to return plundered goods on multiple occasions, as this wasn't the time to loot southern land. After all, this expedition was for war against Tekle Hamenot. On April 12th, while on the march, Menelik met up with a group of Oromo cavalry from Wello, led by the so-called warrior princess Mastawat. Menelik had to order her soldiers to return plundered loot as well. By April 21st, the Shawan army arrived at a place called Bunosachi, where they spotted the fires of Ras Darazo's army. Only a river divided Menelik's army from Darazo's. Gobana, who had taken up the mantle as vanguard, began clearing the area around the river to ensure a strong crossing. By the 23rd of April, Menelik sent a letter where he rebuked Darazo and told him to return to Gojam. Darazo responded saying that he would comply, but also that if Tekle Hamenot arrived to take control of the army, then its decisions would be out of his control. A few days later, the Gojamis began heading eastwards, headed back to their home province. By the 28th of May, Menelik received word assuring him that the Gojami army was headed home, but also a letter containing a challenge to battle from Tekle Hamenot himself. Menelik began heading northwards 2 days later. By the 6th of June, Menelik had learned that the Gojamis had arrived at Embabo. He marched his army northwards for 3 hours, arriving at the plain of Embabo. Tekle Hamenot's army had entrenched itself on the other side. Menelik mounted his horse. It was time for a battle. The Gojami army was possibly about 5,000 men, and it's likely that most, if not all, of these men wielded guns, especially the Remington rifles gifted by Yohannes. Furthermore, Tekle Hamenot had 6 cannon, but seems to have had little to no cavalry. Tekle Hamenot seems to have been confident in the ability of his gunmen and cannon to repel cavalry attacks, which I'm sure he would have known were coming. In comparison, Menelik's army certainly had access to firearms as well. Trade connections ensured that much, but given how many of these were older imports or through French traders, they were often of low quality in comparison to the Remington-wielding army of Tekle-Hamenot. This wouldn't be too much of a problem for Menelik anyway, because he had two, probably large forces of Oromo cavalry, one commanded by Rascobana and the other being the force from Wallo. These Oromo cavalry seem to have primarily been equipped with spears, in comparison to the gun-wielding army of Tekle-Hamenot. Menelik sent forward Rascobana and his cavalry to initiate combat, but they were dispersed by Gojami cannon fire. So far, Tekle-Hamenot's plan was working perfectly. Then his cannon broke down after the third volley. Seizing on this opportunity, the Wallo cavalry force, which had concealed itself to the Gojami right, swept onto it, and Rascobana's cavalry, which had reformed, returned, capturing the Gojami camp and descending on the Gojami left. The Gojami center collapsed, and their line split into two. Within 2 hours of combat initiation, Negus Tekle-Hamenot had been captured, according to some Oromo traditions, by a slave. Impressively, the Gojamis held for 5 more hours, in spite of the loss of their commander, before they finally surrendered. Both the Shawans and the Gojamis lost comparable amounts of troops in the battle. The Italian traveler Antonelli accounts that in combat, 913 Shawans were killed, along with 1,648 wounded, and that a disease outbreak at camp killed 3,121 men. The Gojamis, on the other hand, are said to have lost about 929 men killed, and 1,728 wounded in combat. Some sources make far higher claims in the amount of Gojami losses, some saying that about 2,500 Gojamis were killed, and Antonelli even going as far as to say that 70% of the Gojami army was killed in combat. The validity of these estimates is foggy, but what is clear is that Tekle-Hamenot lost about 3,700 rifles, 6 cannon, and his freedom to the Shawan king, and in this respect, despite the possibly even death counts, Menelik's army came out on top. Emperor Yohannes was understandably infuriated that his vassals had actually gotten into open war. He marched an army down to Menelik's border. Again, neither the emperor nor the Shawan Negus was eager to engage in open war. In fact, many of Menelik's nobles were wary of again going to battle against the well-armed riflemen of the type they had just fought, which Yohannes certainly had in spades. In negotiations, Yohannes forced Menelik to release Tekle-Hamenot and forced the return of valuable guns and cannon. Captured swords, spears, horses, and mules were allowed to stay with the Shawans. By February of 1883, it was decided that Yohannes' son, Ras Arya Selassie, would marry Menelik's daughter, a woman named Zaditu, and that Prince Arya would be the next emperor of Ethiopia. As a dowry, Menelik was required to relinquish control of Wallo to his son-in-law. Menelik wasn't the only one to lose land. Negotiations also forced Tekle-Hamenot to lose Agamotr, but this wasn't enough to balance the fact that peace negotiations clearly favored Menelik. While he lost the province and his captured weaponry, he got the emperor's consent to a strategically valuable marriage with Taitu, a woman who would prove herself to be very important in Ethiopian history, and was essentially granted the reins to embark on a bloody campaign that would expand Ethiopia's southern, western, and eastern frontiers, all while securing Menelik as one of, if not the, most powerful man in the empire.